In ancient Egypt, beneath the grandeur of temples and the silent gaze of colossal statues, lay a justice system that operated with ruthless precision, especially when women were accused of violating societal norms. Few transgressions provoked a more brutal response than adultery, the divine principle of order, balance, and truth. Adultery was not merely a personal betrayal, it was viewed as a threat to familial legacy and dynastic stability. Within elite households, especially among the nobility and priestly classes, a woman's chastity was tied directly to her husband's honor and legitimacy. Accusations, often unproven, could lead to immediate and irreversible punishment. One of the most common recorded penalties was public flogging. Carried out in open spaces near market squares or temple enclosures, the punishment was designed to inflict more than pain. It was a deliberate spectacle meant to shame and degrade. The Wilbur Papyrus, a late New Kingdom land register, does not describe specific punishments, but does hint at a rigid and hierarchical legal order, where women were rarely given equal standing before the law. Legal texts from the New Kingdom show that women, though possessing the right to own property and represent themselves in court, could still face severe penalties for adultery, especially if the accusation came from a husband or male guardian. One chilling example appears during the reign of Ramesses III in the infamous Harem conspiracy. Though primarily a political plot, court records, recorded on papyri such as the Turin Judicial Papyrus, reveal that women involved with palace guards or conspirators were subjected to public beatings and mutilations. This event illustrates how accusations of moral transgression, real or alleged, were punished harshly, especially within royal or political contexts. Public flogging was never solely about justice. It reinforced control, power, and the boundaries women were not permitted to cross. The spectacle ensured that all who watched would remember the price of disobedience. There was no recourse, no appeal. The sentence was immediate and the shame permanent. And while the stone walls of Egypt's temples still stand, the echoes of these women's cries have long since faded into the sands. Nose cutting for adultery, a mark of eternal shame. In the harsh legal codes of ancient Egypt, nose cutting was one of the most severe punishments reserved for women accused, or even merely suspected, of adultery, particularly within the royal court and noble households. This act, both punitive and symbolic, transformed the human face into a public declaration of guilt. The practice was not widespread across the general population, but was employed in politically charged or high-profile cases where the reputational damage of a woman's perceived betrayal extended beyond the personal into the social and dynastic realms. In such instances, the aim was not simply justice, it was permanent disgrace. Records from the late period of Egyptian history indicate that the punishment of mutilation, particularly facial disfigurement, was practiced in cases where women had violated the expected standards of personal conduct and moral behavior. While the formal legal texts rarely describe these punishments in detail, Egyptian literature and secondary references from contemporaneous cultures offer glimpses into their severity. The Demotic Chronicle, an ancient Egyptian text composed under Persian rule, describes how certain pharaohs were condemned for cruel justice, some ordering the cutting off of noses and ears of women and men alike. Though framed as criticism, the text confirms the historical use of such mutilations as state-sanctioned punishment. To lose one's nose in ancient Egypt was more than a disfigurement. It was a visible curse, marking a woman as unclean, untrustworthy, and socially dead. The face, so central in Egyptian art and religious belief, was sacred. Facial integrity was vital for recognition in the afterlife. Mutilation, therefore, carried spiritual consequences that extended far beyond the physical pain. In elite households where lineage and inheritance were paramount, a woman suspected of threatening the bloodline could be condemned not through execution, but through humiliation. By cutting her nose, the accusers severed her from society, family, and even eternity. Historical records from neighboring cultures, such as Assyria and Persia, confirm that nose-cutting as a penalty for moral transgression was not unique to Egypt, but within Egyptian society, its rare application suggests it was reserved for symbolic, high-impact punishment. Reserved for those whose disgrace needed to be permanent and publicly understood. A woman branded in this way would not marry again, would not serve in the temple, and would likely die in obscurity, her face a living indictment. The sentence was irreversible. It did not allow for repentance, only silence. This was how ancient Egyptian society ensured that certain violations would be remembered not in words, but in scars. Buried alive, the pharaoh's cruel punishment for royal treason. In ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was not only a king but also the living embodiment of divine will, treason was far more than political rebellion. It was a spiritual abomination. And when women, particularly those from within the palace walls, conspired against the sovereign, their punishment was designed to be both final and unforgettable. Among the most chilling of these was the act of being buried alive. This punishment was not common. It was rare, precise, and reserved for the most unpardonable offence: treason by a woman of royal blood. No example captures its cruelty more starkly than the events of the Harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III, the last great ruler of Egypt's new kingdom. Around 1155 BCE, a faction within the royal court plotted to assassinate Ramesses III and install a lesser queen's son, Pentaweret, on the throne. The queen in question, Tiye, was a secondary wife, not the great royal wife. The plan involved servants, scribes, and women from the harem, many of them motivated by promises of wealth or revenge. But the conspiracy was uncovered. What followed was one of the most detailed criminal investigations in Egyptian history. Preserved on the judicial papyrus of Turin, the records reveal that over 40 people were tried by a special tribunal. The women involved faced especially brutal outcomes. While male conspirators were executed, some by suicide, others by forced death, the punishment for certain royal women was unique. The tribunal decreed that several women be taken to a place and left there, a phrase interpreted by Egyptologists as being buried alive, a death sentence carried out in isolation, without bloodshed and in silence. This method avoided sacrilegious violence against a woman of royal standing while still ensuring a slow, inescapable death beneath the sands. No tombs were prepared for these women. No funerary rites were granted. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, where every person's soul required careful passage through the underworld, to die without burial rites, or worse, buried alive, was to be denied eternity itself. This punishment struck at the heart of Egyptian belief. Without proper mummification and ritual, the soul could not reunite with its body, could not pass judgment before Osiris, and could not live on. For these women, death was not merely physical. It was spiritual erasure. And so they were taken, still breathing, into the desert or catacombs near the palace grounds. Covered in earth, perhaps entombed in hidden shafts, they vanished from the records. In ancient Egypt, to betray the pharaoh was to challenge the divine order itself. And the punishment was designed not only to end life, but to erase it, from memory, from legacy, and from the eternal world that every Egyptian once hoped to enter. Exile to Rhinocolura's harsh desert. In some cases, the ancient Egyptian state imposed a punishment more lingering than execution and more dehumanizing than public mutilation. Exile, forced banishment to the desolate edges of civilization. And nowhere symbolized this punishment more than Rhinocolura, known in antiquity as a place of despair, disfigurement, and slow disappearance. Rhinocolura, located along the Sinai coast near the border of modern Gaza and Egypt, was a site of notorious reputation. The name itself, derived from the Greek rhino, nose, and colura, cut off, was said to describe the mutilated exiles who had their noses cut off before being cast out. While the city would later be ruled under Persian and Hellenistic control, its role as a destination for Egyptian exile likely began in the late period, when Egypt faced increasing internal instability and foreign interference. Though exact Egyptian records about Rhinocolura are scarce, multiple classical sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, refer to it as a penal settlement. Diodorus recounts how criminals, especially those convicted of treason, were sent there after mutilation and forced to survive on the margins. These included both men and women whose crimes had made them unfit for Egyptian society but too politically delicate to be executed outright. Women sentenced to Rhinocolura were often those connected to the palace, servants, priestesses, or lesser wives implicated in conspiracies or acts of disloyalty. While Egyptian legal texts rarely detail the punishment, the fate was clear. Exile was a living death. Stripped of name, family, and afterlife rights, these women were expelled from the land of the Nile to a desert where survival was uncertain and where they were meant to be forgotten. Life in Rhinocolura was harsh. The settlement lay on arid, barren ground, surrounded by sand dunes and saline swamps. Food was scarce and water unreliable. Those exiled were marked not just by their crimes, but by physical mutilation. A cut nose meant instant recognition, a permanent symbol of disgrace that no veil or passage of time could conceal. Unlike death, exile was meant to last. It offered no closure, no burial, and no return. A woman sent to Rhinocolura would never see her home again. Her name would be erased from household stelae, her image chipped away from tomb walls. In a culture obsessed with memory and immortality, she was condemned to the worst fate imaginable, to be forgotten. Egypt's harshest verdicts, flogging, nose-cutting, buried alive desert exile, showed power branding flesh and souls. Their echoes warn every age when justice becomes spectacle. Which sentence cut deepest into Egyptian society? Comment below. Them cutting off their noses settled them in a colony on the edge of the desert. Diodorus Siculus,